Frank, what are you doing? Sarah's voice startled me and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, an amused smile playing on her lips. Misha, I said, simply gesturing toward the dog. He's been acting strange. I'm just trying to figure out what's bothering him. She walked over, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked down at Misha. Maybe he's just hearing something we can't. Dogs pick up on all kinds of things, you know. Maybe, I said, though the explanation didn't satisfy me. Misha wasn't just reacting to a noise, he was trying to tell me something. Sarah knelt down and scratched behind Misha's ears, her touch gentle. You're making your dad worry, huh, buddy? She said softly. Misha's tail wagged again, but his eyes didn't leave the corner. Sarah straightened up, shaking her head with a laugh. You're going to drive yourself crazy over this, she said to me, her tone teasing. Maybe, I repeated, though her words didn't ease the knot of anxiety in my chest. As the day wore on, I tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on work and the usual hum of family life. But when night fell, Misha's GR returned, low and steady, vibrating in the stillness of the house. This time I didn't try to distract myself or explain it away. Instead, I sat down on the floor beside him, watching the shadows stretch across the room. What is it, boy? I whispered, more to myself than to him. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before returning to the corner, and in that moment I felt it again, that strange unshakable certainty that he was seeing something I couldn't. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, every shift of the house seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, and through it all Misha stayed by the door, his silent vigil a reminder had whatever this was, it wasn't over. What I didn't know then was that Misha's instincts would lead us down a path I never could have anticipated, a path that would test not only my understanding of him but also my own sense of what it meant to protect my family. The days rolled on, but the tension in the house only grew. Misha's behavior became more insistent. It wasn't just the low growls anymore. He had started pawing at the floor, his nails scratching against the wooden boards in a rhythmic, almost desperate manner. Every night he'd stationed himself in front of that same corner, his eyes locked onto the spot like it held some dark secret. At first Sarah tried to brush it off. He's probably reacting to some sound from outside, she said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. You know how sensitive dogs' ears are, I nodded, though my unease was impossible to ignore. But it's the same spot, Sarah, every time. Doesn't that seem strange to you? She sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. It is, but what are we supposed to do? Tear down the wall because the dog doesn't like it? Her words were meant to lighten the mood, but they only made the knot in my chest tighten. I glanced over at Misha, who was lying in his usual spot, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes wide open, still watching. I just can't shake the feeling that he's trying to tell us something. That night I decided to keep a closer eye on him. As the house settled into its usual quiet, I followed Misha upstairs. Sitting in the hallway as he resumed his post outside my son's room, he began to whine softly, his nose nudging at the floorboards, his body tense as if waiting for something to happen. All right, boy, I whispered. What do you see? What are you trying to tell me? I leaned against the wall, my hand absent-mindedly running over the grain of the wood. It felt solid beneath my palm, but there was something about it that felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Misha, as if sensing my growing determination, began to paw at the floor again, his movements more frantic than before. The sound of his nails against the wood echoed through the quiet house, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some idle curiosity on his part. He was trying to lead me to something. By the next morning I had made up my mind. Ignoring Sarah's skeptical look, I cleared the furniture away from the corner, determined to investigate more thoroughly. You're really going to do this? She asked, arms crossed as she watched me pull out my tools. Yes, I replied simply, I have to, as I began tapping along the wall, searching for any signs of weakness. Misha sat beside me, his tail wagging softly. His presence was both reassuring and unnerving, as if he knew I was finally taking his warning seriously. The hollow sound of one section of the wall caught my that cold December night. Everything seemed perfectly in place. The soft glow of Christmas lights twinkled through the living room window, and the faint sound of laughter and festive music echoed from the neighborhood. It was the kind of tranquility that made me feel at peace, even if just for a fleeting moment amidst the demands of daily life. But that calm was abruptly shattered by a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from upstairs. Something was wrong. At first I thought it was just the creak of an old house settling in for the night, the kind of noise you learn to ignore after years of living in the same place. But then it came again, a soft, deliberate growl. Misha, my loyal dog, was standing at the foot of the stairs, his ears perked, his body tense. His eyes were fixed on the dark hallway leading to my son's room, and for a moment a chill ran down my spine. Misha wasn't the kind of dog to growl unnecessarily. He was gentle, almost unnervingly so, as if he had been born with an innate understanding of how to care for us. Yet here he was growling at a corner of the house that had always seemed perfectly normal. I hesitated, wondering if perhaps he'd heard the wind or caught the scent of something outside, but his unwavering focus told me otherwise. I called out to him softly, Misha, what's wrong, boy? His growl faded, replaced by a soft whine, but he didn't move. He stayed rooted to the spot, his gaze never leaving the dark hallway. It was as if he was trying to tell me something he couldn't put into words, but that he desperately wanted me to understand. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. Misha stayed by my son's door, his body a silent sentinel, and in the quiet hours of the early morning as I lay awake in my bed I realized I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Whatever was bothering Misha wasn't going to go away on its own. I didn't know it then, but that growl, that moment of unease was just the beginning. It was the start of a journey that would reveal just how deeply our bond with animals goes, how their instincts and love for us can defy explanation and logic. I couldn't have imagined then what Misha was protecting us from, or how much he would come to mean to me in the days to come. Misha had always been more than just a dog. To me he was my companion, my shadow, my silent confidant. In moments when words failed, but over the next few days his behavior grew more puzzling and my initial unease only deepened. Every night like clockwork he would position himself near my son's room, staring at the same corner, growling softly. By the third night I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was bothering him and I needed to understand what it was. I have always prided myself on being a practical man. I'm not one to get caught up in superstition or indulge in fantasies about unseen dangers, but watching Misha, his body stiff, his eyes full of a silent urgency, I couldn't help but feel like there was something I was missing. I walked over to the corner he seemed so fixated on, crouched down and ran my hand along the floor. It felt solid, unremarkable. Still I tapped along the wall and the baseboards, searching for loose panels or hidden damage. Nothing. The corner was as ordinary as any other in the house. I sat back on my heels, glancing at Misha. He tilted his head, his gaze never leaving that spot, and let out a soft whine, almost as if he was disappointed I hadn't found what he could sense. "It's okay, boy," I murmured, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. He patted closer, pressing his nose against my hand. There was a weight in his expression, a kind of quiet determination that unsettled me. That night as I lay in bed I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. What was I missing? The house was old, yes, but it had been well cared for. Sarah, my wife, had grown up here, and it had always been a place of warmth and stability. There was no logical reason for anything to be wrong, yet the thought gnawed at me, refusing to let go. The next morning I found myself standing in my son's room, staring at that corner again. Misha sat beside me, his tail wagging slightly as if to encourage me. I moved the small bookshelf that rested against the wall, feeling a pang of guilt for disturbing the carefully organized rows of books and toys behind it. The wall looked just as solid as the rest of the room, no discoloration, no cracks. Still I pressed my hand against it, half expecting something to crumble beneath my touch. Nothing. Attention, and I felt my breath hitch. Could this be it? Sarah came over, her curiosity finally outweighing her skepticism. "Did you find something?" "Maybe," I said, my voice low. I pried open a section of the baseboard, revealing a narrow gap that had been hidden behind layers of paint and wood. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set my heart racing. Misha's ears perked up and he let out a small bark, his tail wagging furiously. Now S knelt beside me, her expression shifting from doubt to concern. "What is that?" she asked, pointing toward the dark crevice. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we're about to find out." The sense of mystery only deepened as we peered into the gap, the faint smell of damp wood and Milo wafting out. It was the kind of smell that made my stomach twist, a reminder that not everything hidden was meant to stay that way. I stood up, brushing the dust off my hands, and looked at Misha. His eyes met mine, and for a moment it felt as though he was urging me forward. This wasn't over, not yet. By the following morning I was fully consumed by the mystery of what lay behind that wall. The air in the house felt heavier, and even Sarah, who had dismissed it all as overthinking, seemed quieter than usual. Misha, as always, stayed close to me, his unwavering focus on the corner of my son's room serving as a constant reminder that there was more to uncover. I decided it was time to take a closer look. That small gap in the baseboard wasn't enough to tell me what was hidden inside, and every time I glanced at it the knot in my stomach tightened. So with a mixture of determination and dread I gathered my tools and prepared to dig deeper. "Are you sure about this, Frank?" Sarah asked, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Yes," I said firmly. "I need to know what's going on. Misha isn't acting like this for no reason." She didn't argue further, but the worry in her eyes was hard to miss. As I worked to remove more of the baseball bow, Misha sat nearby, his tail wagging slightly, his gaze fixed on the wall as if encouraging me. When I finally pried away a larger section, the sight that greeted me made my heart skip a beat. Behind the wall the wood was damp and dark, strewn with mold that crept along the beams like an unwelcome guest. The smell of mildew was stronger now, almost overpowering, and I had to take a step back to catch my breath. Misha whined softly, pawing at the floor as if to say, "Keep going." I leaned in closer, shining a flashlight light into the opening. The beams looked warped, and there was an unsettling sense of decay that I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a cosmetic issue, it was structural. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if the damage was more extensive than I realized? What if it was compromising the safety of the house? "Frank, what is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Mold," I said, standing up and wiping my hands on my jeans, "and it looks like the wood is rotting. We need to get someone in here To check it out, her face paled and she glanced at the corner as if seeing it in a new light. Do you think it's serious? I don't know, I admitted, glancing at Misha. He sat still, his ears perked, his eyes watching me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. But I'm not taking any chances. That afternoon I called a home inspector. When I explained the situation, he sounded skeptical, but he agreed to come by the next morning. As we waited, the house seemed quieter than usual, the kind of silence that made you hyper aware of every creak and groan. Misha stayed by my side, his presence a comforting anchor in the midst of my growing anxiety. That night as I lay in bed, my mind refused to settle. I kept replaying the image of the damp rotting wood, wondering how long it had been there, hidden behind the walls, and through it all Misha's quiet vigilance was a constant reminder that this wasn't just about the house, it was about the people inside it. By the time the inspector arrived the next morning, I was a bundle of nerves. He was a no-nonsense kind of man with a clipboard in one hand and a flashlight in the other as he walked through the house, tapping on walls and twisting with each hollow sound. Finally he stopped in front of the corner in my son's room. It's definitely damp, he said, crouching down to take a closer look. Could be a leaky pipe or poor insulation. Either way it's not good. Can you tell how bad it is? As I asked, my voice tight. Not yet, he said, standing up and jotting something, measuring moisture levels. I followed close behind, my stomach down on his clipboard. But need to open up the wall to see what we're dealing with. Are you okay with that? I nodded, though the thought of tearing into the wall made my chest tighten. As he worked I stood to the side, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Misha sat beside me, his body tense, his eyes never leaving the inspector. When the inspector finally pulled away a section of the wall, the sight that greeted us was worse than I'd imagined. The wood was almost completely rotted through and the mold had spread far beyond what was visible from the outside. But that wasn't the worst part. As the inspector shone his flashlight into the opening, he paused, his expression shifting from professional detachment to concern. You've got a serious problem here, he said, his voice grave. One of the main support beams is compromised. If this isn't fixed soon, it could cause structural failure. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Structural failure, the words echoed in my mind, each syllable heavier than the last. My son's room, the place where he played, slept, dreamed, was sitting on the edge of disaster. I looked down at Misha, my throat tight with emotion. He had known. Somehow he had known all along. The inspector's words echoed in my mind long after he left. Structural failure. The idea of my son sleeping in a room that was literally on the verge of collapse was almost too much to bear. The rest of the day passed in a haze as Sarah and I scrambled to call contractors and figure out the next steps. But no matter how chaotic things became, Misha remained calm, watching everything unfold with an almost eerie patience. The following morning a team of contractors arrived. They worked quickly to assess the damage, confirming what the inspector had warned us about. The support beam in the wall was severely compromised and there was significant water damage to the surrounding area. It wasn't just a repair, it was a rescue mission for our home, and time was of the essence. The workers began their demolition, tearing down the wall piece by piece. As the debris piled up I stood to the side, my heart sinking with every crumbling plank and splinter of wood. Misha sat next to me, his eyes fixed on the scene as if he were supervising the entire operation. I couldn't help but feel a deep gratitude for him. Without his persistent warnings, we might never have discovered the danger until it was too late. Frank, one of the contractors, called out, pulling me from my thoughts. You'll want to see this. I walked over, my stomach twisting with dread. He pointed to the now exposed beam, which was worse than I had imagined. It was so warped and weakened that it seemed like it could snap at any moment. But then he gestured towards something else, a thin crack running along the foundation near the beam. This is what caused the water damage, he explained. It's a slow leak, but over time it's weakened everything around it. If you hadn't caught it when you did, the whole room could have started to sag, or worse. I swallowed hard, the gravity of his words sinking in. Misha had saved us, plain and simple. His instincts had alerted us to a danger we couldn't see, and his persistence had given us the time we needed to act. I reached down to scratch behind his ears, my throat tight with emotion. Good boy, Misha, I whispered, you were a hero. The repairs took several days. The contractors worked tirelessly, replacing the rotted beam, sealing the crack in the foundation, and reinforcing the entire structure. During that time, Misha rarely left my side. He seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation, his usual playful demeanor replaced by a quiet vigilance. At night I would sit on the floor with him, watching as he rested his head on his paws but kept his ears perked, ready to spring into action at the slightest sound. It was in those moments that I realized just how deeply he cared for us, not just as a pet but as a protector, a member of our family who would do anything to keep us safe. On the final day of repairs, the contractors declared the room safe again. The beam had been replaced, the mold and water damage removed, and the structure reinforced to withstand anything that might come its way. As I stood in the room, now clean and secure, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Misha padded over to the corner that had been the source of so much tension, sniffing the newly repaired wall. Before sitting back on his haunches, he let out a deep sigh, his body relaxing for the first time in days. It was as if he knew his job was done, his mission accomplished. That night, as I tucked my Sun into bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the contractors who had worked tirelessly to fix our home, gratitude for the inspector who had uncovered the danger, and most of all gratitude for Misha, who had seen what none of us could and refused to give up until we listened. As I turned off the light and closed the door, I looked down at Misha, who was lying in the hallway outside my son's room. "You're amazing, you know," that I said softly, crouching down to meet his gaze. His tail waged slightly and he leaned into my hand as I scratched behind his ears. "You saved us, buddy. I don't know how, but you did." He licked my hand, his eyes warm and trusting, and in that moment I knew he understood. Misha wasn't just a dog, he was our guardian, our hero, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love come in the quiet, determined gestures of those who ask for nothing in return. As the dust settled and the house returned to its normal rhythm, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The contractors were gone, the repairs were complete, and life seemed to have resumed its usual course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not in the house but in me. Misha had always been an important part of our lives, but now I saw him in a completely different light. He wasn't just a dog, he was a protector, a silent guardian who had been willing to stand his ground and fight for us in his own way. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of just how much we owed him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a warm glow across the living room, I found myself sitting on the floor with Misha. He lay stretched out beside me, his eyes half closed in contentment. I reached out, running my hand over his thick fur, and felt a pang of gratitude so deep it brought tears to my eyes. "You knew, didn't you?" I said softly, my voice breaking the stillness. "You knew something was wrong before any of us had a clue." Misha lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching as if he were listening. His eyes met mine, and for a moment it felt like he understood every word I was saying. I smiled, wiping at my eyes. "You saved us, buddy." I'll never forget that as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice how deeply Misha's actions had affected all of us. Sarah, who had initially been skeptical of his behavior, now doted on him more than ever. She would often sit with him in the evenings, scratching behind his ears and telling him what a good boy he was. And my son, who had always adored Misha, seemed to see him as more than just a playmate. Now he would hug him tightly before bed, whispering secrets into his ear as if Misha were his closest confidant. One afternoon, as I was working in the yard, I caught my son talking to Misha near the porch. His voice was soft, almost reverent, as he said, "You're my hero, Misha. You kept me safe." Misha responded with a gentle nuzzle, his tail wagging slowly, and I felt my heart swell with pride. But it wasn't just our family that had been changed. I found myself sharing the story with friends and neighbors, each retelling reminding me of just how extraordinary Misha was. People listened with wide eyes and amazed expressions and marveling at his instincts and loyalty. "Dogs are incredible," one of them said. "They see the world in ways we can't even begin to understand." It was true. Misha had shown me that there's so much more to animals than we often give them credit for. Their instincts, their love, their unwavering loyalty, their gifts we don't always appreciate until they're laid bare in moments of crisis. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of the living room, I thought about everything Misha had taught me. He had reminded me of the importance of listening, not just with my ears but with my heart. He had shown me that love isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's quiet and steadfast, expressed in the simplest of actions. And most of all, he had taught me to trust in the bonds we share with those who love us, no matter how different they might be from us. Looking over at Misha, who was curled up on his favorite rug, I felt a deep sense of peace. He had given us more than we could ever repay, but I knew he didn't expect anything in return. That was the beauty of his love. It was unconditional, selfless, and pure. I leaned over and scratched behind his ears, whispering, "Thank you, Misha, for everything." He opened one eye, his tail thumping softly against the floor, and I couldn't help but laugh. He didn't need words to tell me. He understood in his own quiet way. He always did. The moment of crisis had passed, but its echoes lingered in ways I hadn't anticipated. Life had returned to normal, at least on the surface. My son's room was repaired, safe, and filled once again with the joyful chaos of childhood. Sarah and I found comfort in the routine of daily life, but there was a quiet shift in how we approached the world, a newfound awareness of the unseen connections that bound us together. Misha, ever watchful, had also settled back into his usual habits. He no longer growled at corners or pawed at the floor. It was as if he knew his job was done, but his presence felt different now, stronger, more meaningful. Every wag of his tail, every glance from his amber eyes seemed to carry an unspoken message. "I'm here always." One crisp morning, as the golden light of sunrise filtered through the windows, I found myself watching Misha as he lay by the fireplace. His chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm of peacefulness in his posture that mirrored my own feelings of gratitude. I crouched beside him, running my hand over his fur, and let my mind wander back to the events of the past few weeks. There was something profound about the way he had acted, the way he had used to back down when something was wrong. I thought about the countless times I had dismissed his warnings, at first chalking them up to quirks or distractions. It was humbling, realizing how close I had come to ignoring the one being who had been trying to save us all along. Later that evening, as the house grew quiet, Sarah and I sat together reflecting on Everything that had happened, she turned to me, her voice soft. You know, I always thought I understood Misha, but after all this it's like I see him in a completely new way. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He's not just a dog, I said, he's part of this family in a way I never really appreciated before. What he did for us, it wasn't instinct alone, it was love, pure and simple. Sarah smiled, her hand resting on mine. We're lucky to have him, she said. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if he hadn't been here. Her words stayed with me long after she had gone to bed. Misha's actions had saved more than just the house, they had reminded us of the bonds that truly mattered. His loyalty and love had brought us closer as a family, showing us the kind of courage and selflessness that I could only hope to emulate. The next day I took Misha for a long walk through the woods near our home. It was his favorite place, a stretch of winding trails and towering trees that seemed to hold a kind of magic for him. As we walked I watched the way his nose twitched at every new scent, the way his tail wagged with unrestrained joy at the simple pleasure of being outside. He reminded me in his quiet way to appreciate the little things, to find wonder in the world around me. When we reached a clearing I sat on a fallen log and Misha lay at my feet. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine, and the sky stretched out above us in a canopy of soft blues and golds. I looked down at him, his eyes half closed in contentment, and felt a surge of gratitude that words couldn't capture. You've taught me more than I ever thought possible, I said quietly, about trust, about love, about what it means to really care for someone. I don't know how to thank you for that. Misha opened one eye, his gaze meeting mine, and gave a slow, deliberate wag of his tail. It was enough. He didn't need grand gestures or elaborate words. He understood, as he always had. That evening as we returned home I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The house, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt warm and safe, and at the heart of it all was Misha, our silent hero, our guardian, and the soul of our family. As I look back on everything that happened, one thought lingers above all others: how easily we could have missed the signs. It's a humbling realization that the very things we take for granted, the quiet and steady presences in our lives, often carry the strength to protect us when we need it most. For our family, that presence was Misha. These days I find myself reflecting more often, noticing the small ways he continues to impact our lives. The way he waits patiently by the door when my son comes home from school, his tail wagging before the sound of footsteps even reaches the porch. The way he curls up beside Sarah on the couch, his head resting on her lap as she strokes his fur absent-mindedly. And the way he always finds me during quiet moments, sitting at my feet as if to remind me that I'm never alone. Misha has taught me that love isn't about grand gestures, it's about consistency, loyalty, and the willingness to be there when it matters most. He didn't growl at that corner of the room for recognition or praise. He did it because he cared, because protecting us was simply part of who he was, and that kind of selfless love is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. There's a quiet joy in knowing that we were given a second chance, that the story could have ended so differently if not for his persistence. I think about the nights I'd brushed off his behavior, too focused on my own assumptions to see what he was trying to tell me. It's a lesson I'll never forget: to listen more closely, to trust more deeply, and to always be open to the unexpected ways love reveals itself. Tonight, as I sit by the fire, Mishel lies at my feet, his breathing soft and steady. The house is warm and safe, the echoes of that once looming danger now just a distant memory. My son is asleep in his room, Sarah is reading quietly by the window, and everything feels as it should. But there's a depth to this peace that wasn't there before, a gratitude that fills every corner of the house, a recognition of just how much we owe to the hero who saved us. I reach down to scratch behind Misha's ears, and he lifts his head, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet wisdom that never fails to amaze me. You're more than a good boy, Misha, I whisper. You're the best of us, he responds with a gentle nudge of his nose against my hand, his tail thumping softly against the floor. It's a simple moment, but one that feels profound in its quietness, because in that moment I know he understands, he always has. As the fire crackles and the night settles and I find myself smiling, a deep and unshakable sense of peace washing over me. Misha has given us so much: his love, his loyalty, his unwavering determination to keep us safe, and for that I'll be forever grateful. Misha isn't just a dog, he's a part of our family, a guardian of our hearts, and a reminder of the quiet heroism that so often goes unnoticed in the world. He's taught me to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to cherish the bonds that connect us, and to trust in the power of love no matter the form it takes.